Hey, I'm Matty Gervais from The Head and the Heart, and this is the LSQ podcast.
On the heels of the announcement last week of a much-anticipated new album by indie folk band The Head and the Heart, I'm excited to be able to share the following conversation with the band's Matty Gervais, one of your first chances to hear more about their exceptional new collection of tunes, a sixth full-length album called Aperture that will be out on May 9th. Hey, I'm Jenny LSQ. Thanks for checking out this episode of the LSQ podcast. It was a pleasure to connect over Zoom with Matty to talk about the making of Aperture and how it heralds a new chapter of freedom and collaboration for The Head and the Heart. We also talked about some earlier The Head and the Heart history, how they have benefited in more recent years from band therapy, and Matty's own personal creative process for this new LP. Of course, we also delve into Matty's early life experiences with music, growing up in Seattle during the grunge explosion, falling in love with recording his songs, using a boombox technique he heard Dave Grohl describe in an interview, playing in bands with his brother, and eventually joining The Head and the Heart more than a decade ago. Let's get into it. Does everyone call you Matty? Is that the deal?
Everyone always calls me Matty and always has. I think for a little while, I was like, as a young adult, I was like, okay, you can stop calling me Matty now. But it didn't really stick. And so it's just carried on into my adult years, and everyone's just always called me that. So at a certain point, I just started introducing myself as that because I was like, okay, screw it. I can't escape this. I'm never going to be Matthew.
I have come to understand from having read up on you a bit that the Matty thing is also that you have a brother known as Mikey.
Yes.
And that you had a project together called Matty and Mikey.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, that's an ongoing project so long as we both shall live, because brothers are blood runs thicker than whatever the saying is, and we always make music together and always will. So we'll always release music when it's convenient, in and outside of all of our other scheduling things that life brings to the table.
Well, we'll get into talking a little farther down the line about the new album by The Head and the Heart, Aperture, which will have just been announced when people are hearing this episode.
Amazing.
Even though it hasn't yet. Congratulations on the
Thank you.
album announcement.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's super surreal to have it actually starting to finally reveal itself to the world. It's because it's something we've been holding on to for so long at this point. So it's exciting. Like, people are going to get to hear it finally.
Amazing. But we'll come back to talking about the album, since we started off talking about Mikey and Matty and that sort of looking back moment. And that's, a lot of what I like to focus on this show is all the sort of before time stuff. How did you start playing in a band with your brother, and how did you start playing music in general?
I have early memories of being laying on the kitchen and as my mom is making dinner, and I'm grabbing onto her ankle and making up songs about it and things like that. Making songs about just random little things and being silly as a kid. I remember making a song about my mom combing her hair like crazy. There's a funny, she'll laugh if she hears this. But yeah, as far as getting into music and learning it and studying it, I had to pick an instrument when I was in elementary school, and so I picked the drums because I wanted to be in the background. I didn't want to have the pressure of the focus being on me. And then ironically, what ended up happening was they gave me the solo to What Would You Do with a Drunken Sailor? So I had this whole moment where all the eyes were on me on my first ever concert that I ever played, and so, of course, I didn't get to avoid that eventuality. But as a result of starting out on drums, it worked out because having an older brother, he was super into music. He was just a couple years older, so he was more in tune with what was happening. And we just so happened to grow up in Seattle, Washington, where all these bands were coming out. And we were the perfect younger age to be just kind of listening to them and digesting them, but also being completely just in awe of them as almost like superhumans, because we were 10 and 11 or whatever, 12 around that time. Nirvana and Pearl Jam were coming into the airwaves all across the world, throughout the world, and on MTV every 2 seconds. And back when MTV still showed music videos and stuff, that was a huge influence watching that all take place.
And were you, I mean, as a kid, like it's not like if you're 10 or 11, it's not like you're like going to shows or anything. Were you aware only through MTV that, oh, wait a minute, these bands are from here? Or was it just sort of like everyone in town was talking about it? Everyone in town knew that this thing was happening in Seattle in the Northwest that was also felt like a very intense, like regional topic.
Yeah, yeah, it definitely was. Yeah, if yeah, I think we probably wouldn't have known, and we didn't know really when it was like still sort of an underground scene, and people were playing in Pioneer Square bars and going to each other's shows. Like we weren't not aware of it then. We became aware of it when it became more of a global phenomenon for sure. Even though we lived here, but because of that, and because of the awareness that we sort of developed, we became more and more aware of like all the other smaller acts that were coming around, and we'd go. My parents were cool. They would take us to shows. There was a concert series called Pain in the Grass, and we would go every weekend to that when that series was happening, and getting to see a lot of the bands that weren't on MTV every every 20 minutes, and getting to surround ourselves with that. We had Bumbershoot, which is this incredible music festival in Seattle that exposed us to everything from Sir Mix-a-Lot and the Indigo Girls to the presidents of the United States, and national acts too coming through before they got famous, like Sublime, and like one of my earliest concert memories again was from Bumbershoot, and it was Little Richard, and I remember being like not really understanding what I was witnessing, but just remember being kind of like jaw dropped, aghast at what I was seeing, and also like just he said the word "shut up" a bunch of times when the crowd was cheering, loudly, and I thought that he was like a bad guy for saying "shut up" because I was only like 4 years old or something.
And who are you mentioned also just like some of the Seattle artists who were not making it into the mainstream but were still sort of like in the indie sphere part of that era. Can you remember who any of those bands would have been that were meaningful to you as a kid?
Yeah, yeah. Like the Posies and the Fastbacks, the Supersuckers. Gosh, there were so many bands that Sweetwater. There was a lot of bands that we get to like see and do their thing. Gosh, Presidents of the United States, we get to go see them before they became, a national act, and they would play it like in front of 12 people in Occidental Square, and it became kind of a thing that just we were immersed in.
And were your parents your parents were like into music? What was their sort of relationship with music from, even from before you were born?
My mom's dad was into like singing for the choir at church. He was in a deacon choir, and so he would sing spiritual tunes and hymns. I just actually am digging through some old VHS tapes and found footage of him singing the old Irish blessing, with his, and they're all prim and proper with their cute bow ties and singing. My other grandfather on my dad's side was really super into jazz, and he would record jazz broadcasts off of the radio, and he had this just archive of tape cassette after tape cassette after tape cassette, just stacks of those, and also stacks of 45s and 78s of like stuff that you still really can't find like on Spotify or on the internet. It's still like hard to find this stuff, and it's actually sitting in my parents' basement. The other day I started to leaf through it with my dad, and was like, oh my god, yeah, this is like a treasure trove, almost like an archivist's job to go through this and upload it onto, for posterity. It's pretty cool. So there was those two like musical worlds that were, a generation before my parents, both very musical. One on the instrumental side, one on the vocal side with singing. My mom's dad had kind of like a Bing Crosby like crooner voice that was really nice. I think his love for that kind of music has stuck with me as well. Like I still love all the crooner stuff.
But then obviously your parents, they were taking you to concerts, so music rated with them as being, something that they did for fun and that they were into.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, they so neither of them like pursued music. They're both very musical, and they raised us, on vacations listening to Bob Dylan and Bruce Springsteen and the Beatles and Buddy Holly and Neil Young records. So we had this kind of great classic rock upbringing and deep cuts too from all those artists, and so that definitely informed what we eventually wanted to do as we grew into songwriters in our own right. Yeah, for me, I can think of the first record I ever wanted to own was a George Harrison's Cloud Nine, and I'd seen the music video for "I Got My Mind Set on You" on MTV, and asked my parents for that, and so that was one of the first ever records that I owned. That is all to say that my parents were very supportive of pursuing music in all the different forms, and also exposing us to a lot of cool stuff.
And so by the time you're on the kitchen floor, making up a song about your mom brushing her hair, I would imagine your parents responded to an inkling of you being musical with, excitement and encouragement and that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. They were always extremely encouraging. Like my brother and I started a band with our neighbor Phil Hardwick down the street before I could even, and again, this was when I was the drummer. Before I even had any instruments, I was using like a big cardboard box as a bass drum and just kicking it. And I had that snare drum that I used for my fourth grade music class. And we actually recorded a demo tape with that drum set that I just described to you, and a hand-me-down bass guitar that Phil was playing. And my brother had bought his guitar using money from that he had saved from his paper route. And we recorded a demo tape just with a cassette tape of that, and somehow we managed to get a show based on that that demo. And we played our first ever show when I was like 12 at the University District Street Fair. And when we got the show, my dad was like, "Oh, I guess we better buy you a real drum set."
But
So
this
we
was
went.
original. You were playing original songs?
Yeah, yeah. My brother and Phil were kind of the songwriters of that band, and I was the drummer. And but yeah, my brother was very prolific in those days. He still is, and Phil Hardwick was as well. Again, just like channeling the music that we were seeing happening of the generation right before us.
It was sort of alternate alt rock grunge kind of,
Yes.
but little kid version.
Yes, little kid version, and like unintentionally very punk. We thought we sounded more refined than we did, of course, which is true for probably most kids that are 12 and 13 years old. Uh, but listening back, it's like, wow, we were punk as fuck, man. It was good.
When did it start to feel like not just a thing, but like, there's stuff kids do, and they at that age, maybe you're playing music or you're doing sports or you're doing academic things, or you don't really think too much about it, but at a certain point something starts to rise up in your priorities, even as little kid as they might be, where you're like, I really care about this. This is how I see myself. When did that start to happen for you with music?
Yeah, it was pretty early on, I'd say. Because yeah, as I mentioned, I started out as a drummer. Pretty shortly thereafter, I had my brother teach me, the handful of guitar chords so that I could start writing my own songs, in a little bit more refined sense than just laying on the kitchen floor vibes. And so I'd always wanted to just see where that would take me. I'm trying to what it's reminding me of is I remember hearing stories, again, being influenced from this generation, of how Dave Grohl used to record demo tapes, and he would use a boombox, record drums into the one boombox, and then hit play, and then record guitar while the drum beat is playing from one boombox into another boombox, and then record that. So you're basically like doing this very primitive form of overdubbing, multi-tracking. I remember hearing him describe that on some interview, and so I was like, okay, I'm gonna try that too. And so once I had my few chords, I already knew how to play drums a little bit. So my first multi tracks were the same thing and kind of modeling after him and that methodology, and made a few instrumental tracks like that. And that sort of self-driven recording slash writing process evolved into recording onto a 4 track and writing songs and creating like these really in-depth tape cassettes where on one tape cassette I had a band that was my own band. I was a you know that was called Grandstand. I never released any music under this name, but it was named after the Dalmatian that lived down the street from our parents' house that I used to walk. And so I recorded like I'd have a cassette tape of these are my rock and roll songs. These are my punk songs, and I would write. It would maybe be an hour long tape. I would record a song, and then that'd be the first track on the album. And then I'd write and record another song. That'd be the second track on the album, and I would do that until that tape was full, and then I'd start making a new album. And so throughout basically all of middle school and high school, I just wrote album after album, on cassette tape like that, in just kind of chronological order. It was the way that I was able to navigate all of the emotional things that I was going through in relationships. I don't think I would have survived middle school and high school, and frankly anything thereafter, if I hadn't developed that technique and that means of expressing myself. And so, more so than it being like some ambition to pursue some career, it was a process that I needed in order to be myself and to feel whole and to get through the things that we have to get through in life. And it's so ingrained in me that I can't imagine doing anything else. So from that boombox experiment to where I am now, it's just been something that has always been some form of therapeutic documentation of what I'm going through. And it without it, I wouldn't be able to. I don't think I'd be here. So.
Over those years of that incarnation of doing things and experimenting and just making music truly on your own in that way, how did the sound of what you were making change by the time you were kind of at the end of that phase?
I've always given myself a pretty long leash on that because I've known that, the more you invest time wise into every little thing, you just get better in little increments here and there, depending on what skill you're working on at the time. Whether it's, oh, I'm going to write a harmonica part for this song. Okay, well, I better work on my harmonica skills. I'm going to track some synth. Okay, I better make sure that I know how to play the synth. I'm going to learn how to program this drum machine over here. So, like, you're little by little accumulating all these different skills and also refining your ability, your chops, as far as, whatever your guitar abilities, your drum abilities, your singing abilities, and all these things. So there's always like a just incremental improvement over time. But also, I was like, when I said long leash, I was also referring to like stylistically, I would make rap albums, ska albums. I have like multiple cassette tapes filled with rap that I'll never share with the world. That I made as a high schooler. Genre was irrelevant too, and towards figuring out what that discovery was going to be. And for the longest time, I thought I was gonna do like punk, and then I just for whatever reason, like that became like the wrong thing for me in terms of like what I wanted to put out there into the world, outside of the maybe the punk ethos or energy that goes into that kind of music, but that genre as a specific thing, kind of little by little, all these different forays into different worlds sort of honed into something more, classically, singer songwritery for me, I guess. And I keep coming back to the records like Neil Young records and Bruce records and Bob Dylan records and things in that wheelhouse that I was raised on, and Buddy Holly and Everly Brothers and things like that I've mentioned. Those kinds of records became kind of more of the template for what I still aspire to. And of course, the Beatles. The Beatles are everywhere.
And so by the end of high school, was that the thing that, had you arrived at the point where you're like, this is what I want to do. I'm not really gonna this is what I'm gonna try and do.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, even before that, I had probably made the determination that somehow or another I'm going to do music, in life. And whether that was a wise decision or not, I think it's turned out to be a wise decision. But yeah, it was like, there have been plenty of times where it's like, oh gosh, you're little by little closing the door on other things. But again, for me, it was never like, even without any success, it was always going to be something I was going to have to do.
Yeah, you decided you were just gonna go for it.
Yeah, exactly. I always kind of like hedged my bets in some ways. Like I got a college degree, went to the University of Washington. I for the longest time was pursuing different bands and different, projects while also working at various jobs over the years. I worked as a meat department cleanup guy while also playing in a pop band when I was in my early or like immediately after high school. I worked at a balloon store during that time as well. And then I worked at the Seattle Art Museum after college for a long time while I was also pursuing music. And so I've kind of always had one foot in the practical world and one foot in this dream world of making music for a living. And so yeah, eventually when it came time for me to become part of Head and the Heart, that was kind of when I was able to actually step aside and put and do it completely full time.
Because you were playing in a few bands at that time, or was it mainly the project with your brother? And I know that you had done shows with the Head and the Heart, and of course knew each other, as fellow musicians in the same scene.
Yeah, let's see. Well, right around the time that I joined the band, I was in my own band that happened to my brother and I we were in multiple bands together. And so I guess at the time that I joined Head and the Heart, only one of them was still like functional as a band that would still play shows. And that became kind of logistically tricky because, we'd be bouncing back and forth and at a certain point it became clear that I was gonna have to buckle down and go on tour. And this was, oh, this is it. I'm in this band now, referring to Head and Heart, of course. I don't think there's been even a week's time in my life since I was 12 that I wasn't in a band. I've just always I've always played in bands. I've always, sometimes multiple bands at the same time. It's always been a part of me.
And so, setting the scene for folks, the moment at which you officially joined the Head and the Heart as a member of the band, obviously they had already like things had already started to take off for them. So the proposition of becoming a member of the band was like joining this thing that was up and running, but was an opportunity for you to put your stamp on it and to do something at a level that you had never done before.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Before I joined the band, the biggest shows I'd ever played were opening for the NR. And so it was definitely quite exciting to jump into and a great learning experience in terms of how to engage with larger crowds like that and of course touring and what that means and that the dream of being able to be out on the road and making music was thrust upon me in that way, and it was definitely a whirlwind to say the least. That's it's a tricky emotional roller coaster for everybody, and I jumped right in the middle of an insane roller coaster that was far more complex than I would have ever imagined. And so, at first it was just kind of like, okay, we're just holding on to the wagon as it goes and seeing where it takes us. And then, slowly but surely over time, I've been able to find my own foothold within that and figure out who I am within that world and gain more confidence and more ownership and more clarity about my own purpose and what I bring to the table, safe, outside of, just being a supportive cast member, Yeah, it's been a long process. It's been almost a decade now since I've joined the band, and so many different eras have happened within that decade that feels like now it's starting to kind of enter into a new chapter that's exciting, and I feel personally more fully formed within it than ever before.
You had the opportunity though to be a fan of the band before you were a member of the band. I mean, before you had any idea that you would ever be invited to join this group, what were and observing that they were doing well in the scene that you were part of, like what were the things about the Head and the Heart that you appreciated as a fan? And why do you think things popped off for them the way they did so early on?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I feel like there was just, yeah, they're all great people, and there was just an excitement around them. It was the closest thing that I ever experienced to what I imagine it would have been like in the 90s that we talked about earlier, around all of those bands. there was an energy that was happening in the city, and they were at the epicenter of that. And going to their shows was kind of like felt like being let in on this little secret, this thing that was happening that was, just felt like it was on a trajectory going somewhere exciting. And they were all so welcoming and so kind and just really great members of the community in that way. And that's kind of how I was able to become friends with them. That whole world. There's so many other bands that we were all, a part of this ecosystem. And Head in the Heart shows were just really fun to watch. They had a punk energy to them, and they had an urgency to them that was contagious. And I remember, getting to go on tour with them and watch from different parts of the room in some larger theaters that were far larger than the rooms that I was used to playing in, and being like, wow, these people in the back row of this balcony are like singing all the words. This is insane. And so getting to like experience what the show meant and felt like for the people in the crowd, and the level of investment that translates from the people that you see in the very, very front, whose faces and smiles you can see clearly, to the people who you only realize are there when you have them flash their cell phone light back at you. You realize that everyone's just as present and just as invested in the show and invested in the music. And so I feel like as an audience member and a fan, before having joined, I have this sort of shared identity with those fans that I always bring with me to whenever I'm playing in this band and performing for people. It's a shared kind of just like admiration and fandom, truly, that I feel like helps me step outside of myself and just enjoy the show, and put myself into the shoes of those who are in the crowd, and imagining what kind of show they would want to see, because I was once one of those people in that audience.
It must have been interesting as well. I mean, obviously, if I'm understanding correctly, like you and Charity were a couple, you were sort of the beginning of your couplehood or whatever
Yeah.
when you actually joined the band. So you undoubtedly had some insight just from her sharing with you what it was like, what it was like being in the band as it was really blowing up. But as an artist who hadn't reached that level with your own project yet, I imagine you would have had this idea like, oh shit, that must be great, this must be all gravy. It's just, it's nothing but roses over here. Everyone wishes that they had a band that was blowing up in that way. And then, as you alluded to earlier, once you were actually in the band and participating, you were able to experience that it's not as easy as that there's a lot of difficulty in being in a situation where you're in a band that's quote unquote doing well.
Yeah, that's where the big learning curve comes in. And again, yeah, I keep putting myself in the scenarios of, what I would have done, or how things might have gone differently, if one of the previous bands that I was a part of had had that same amount of success. And I think everything happens for a reason in time, the way that life throws things at you when you're ready for them, kind of a thing. And so this was kind of one of those moments where these guys were ready for it, despite how much hardship and trial they all went through as a result of it all. But yeah, it doesn't come without its, challenges, for sure. I think that's ongoing, and everyone's just working on getting better and better at what that means.
Yeah.
It's a lot of self-care, a lot of emotional intelligence, a lot of like things that aren't music that you have to work on to really allow for the music to have its space.
Yeah, without focusing on anything negative, because of course it's an amazing experience, and I know you're all grateful for how it's gone and continues to go. But I do think it's interesting, and and a thing that a lot of music fans don't think about or don't understand, the idea that there are challenging aspects to it. And so, yeah, I'd love to have you tell me just a little bit about what some of those challenges are, or sort of the what are some of the things that you've had to work through in your experience in being in a band that from the outside people might regard as just being like, oh, it must be great to be in that situation.
Yeah, this would be a great one for if more than just myself is on this interview. Like, everyone's got their own things that they have to grapple with. And there are six very different personalities thrust into basically a tube that's flying down the highway at 70 miles per hour. You're sleeping on top of each other, and before that, you're in a van, crammed into next to each other, and somebody's got to stay up driving all night long. You're out of sleep. You're not sleeping. You're partying. There's all kinds of stuff. There's all kinds of miscommunications and things that, and everyone not necessarily bringing their best selves to the table because it's part of like how can you possibly when you don't really have any other there's no rule book or guidebook for how to conduct yourself on and when everyone's thrust into this thing, there's so much excitement, and you're 20 something, you have no compass with which to guide you and make all the right decisions all the time, so there's lots of mistakes that are being made, not intentionally. I don't think anyone ever would intentionally harm each other, but harm is done nonetheless because of the way that pressure cooker affects everyone.
Well, y'all did something that I'm guessing probably more bands do this than talk about it, but you have talked about that you did band therapy a few years back. And
Mhm.
yeah, tell me a bit about just what the value of that experience was.
Yeah, it's ongoing too. We're still working with the same person, and it's been really great. It's gotten a lot less challenging than it was in the early days, when it was a new thing for us all, because a therapy situation is always going to involve some sort of personal reflection that isn't necessarily enjoyable for all parties involved, and that sort of self-reflection is the key to healing those relationships and all that. And so that experience has given us not only that healing but also the vocabulary with that we need to like work through situations as they come up. It's still not easy. It's always there's ups and downs, but I think there's like an underlying understanding that when you show up to these things, that means that everyone wants. It's like a marriage counselor. You show up to the counseling appointment because you both parties want this thing to work, and so that's the same thing here in band therapy, but with six people instead. And so that in and of itself is like you showing up and being present for that is proof in and of itself of your own desire for things to get better.
Yeah, and just having a neutral person to help reframe things, and just like with couples or individual therapy, just knowing like if something's arisen that you're like, you know what, we don't have to freak out that this thing has arisen. We can take it into the room and work through it there, and have this sort of comfort of knowing that there's a place to deal with that, and you don't have to be as catastrophic about when struggles arise because you're like, no, we have a mechanism for pushing through and resolving struggles, and it's this thing that works for us, which is this therapy. And I know like that started probably pretty close to Every Shade of Blue, or maybe in the lead up to the previous album to this new one. So by the time you're going into making Aperture, this has been a thing that you've been doing for a while, and you arrive at making this album with this decision that this is going to be in a way a return to kind of the earlier days of the band and the approach on the earliest stuff, but also this newer, even broader version of the kind of like back to basics, keeping things close to home, producing it yourselves, but also like having an even more democratic process going into the album. So I'd love to hear from you a bit about kind of what your mindset was when the beginning of this album was happening.
Yeah, it's true. It's kind of the perfect storm of sort of positive influences at that time in many ways, because not only had we gone through a period of therapy, we had finished a period of time on a major label, and we were in between labels, so there was nobody telling us what kind of songs they wanted to hear next, nobody telling us what producers we were supposed to be working with. Nothing like that happening. And so all of a sudden that sort of creative compass was our own again. We were also like at a time for a while we were also with no management. We were kind of just free agents for the first time in forever. The closest sort of external circumstances that you could imagine to being zoom back, another 10 years in history, and like when the band is first getting started and everyone's just deciding to show up for each other, going to each other's houses and working on songs, going to the library to work on harmonies, all the things that you hear that were part of this initial like spark of the band, all of a sudden all of that is being driven by ourselves again. That in and of itself, that opening, for me was huge, and I think that's true for everyone too. It just gave the this sense of like relief, and just you can picture the open highway, and you're just starting out, and the sun's coming up. You've got all day. You've got no worries. You've got no concerns, and you're gonna just let it come, because there's all of a sudden you're not those stressors and those things that can really derail the creative process. We're just not there anymore. That paired with better understanding of each other, it just made for a much more open and free flowing process. And we kind of decided to do it between Seattle and Richmond, Virginia. So some contingent of us live in Seattle, and some contingent live in Richmond, Virginia. So we do like a week and a half at a time in either of these locations, which gave the benefit of home turf to some members, which was helpful for them. So when everyone's in Seattle, we get to be home in our normal comfort zone. We get to drive back and forth from the studio as if we're going to a day job, and that felt kind of nice and easy and helped us in that respect. And we both environments came up with. I mean, I think the record is probably an even split between those two locations. Both were very fruitful in different ways. We're working with different engineers in both cities. So there's just a fresh energy coming in. And we kind of had made the mistake enough times before. We're like, okay, we need to make a record. So we could probably get a record done if we just go to the studio for one whole month straight. And like, that's just doomed to fail, because there's diminishing returns. Whereas this time we were like, okay, we know that we're going to get a little burned out after a week. So that's how long the trip's going to be. And then we'll give ourselves some time in between. And again, we were off cycle. There was no imminent deadline. And that just created the perfect circumstances to just allow music to happen rather than trying to strangle it into existence.
Strangle it into existence. That's a fucking visual, right? Live, live.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's right.
So what were the first, because I know that there was a phase where the others were doing some jamming and kind of getting the beds and the beginnings of some songs, but
Mhm.
what were the first couple of tunes that felt like they were coming together, coming together sufficiently that you were like, this is the beginning of the album, this is a song, these are strong songs. What were those first couple of tracks?
So Kenny, Chris, John, and Tyler got together one of the sessions before. Like, me and Charity had just had a baby, so we didn't go to that first session. And I think two of the songs on the record are from that, actually. Like, we eventually overdubbed our own parts to them, but there was an initial spark on two of the songs that are on this record from that session that we weren't even present for, that were just great. I think that session really did set the tone for how, I guess, the modus operandi for how the thing was going to happen, which was basically like everyone just showing up and responding to each other musically. Whoever started an idea, people would just be hearing each other, and at the end of a day in the studio, you'd have some kind of instrumental or some version of some kind of lyrical idea, but not anything refined yet. But you'd have some structure, some instrumental, that at the end of the day, and then you'd move on. And sometimes maybe there'd be two or three different instrumental ideas at the end of the day. And whichever ones kind of decided to continue raising their hands were ones that, like, you'd go back to and return to the next day. Or, if you needed to end up working on one of them for multiple days in a row, that was fine. But they all pretty much started from that initial spark. And every track on the record is some version of a capture from that first day or two in the studio recording and experiencing that song for the first time. So there's not anything that's being like overly like labored over, which also was intentional because we had already done that thing where we in previous records someone had made a demo and then you're trying to like you're trying to beat the demo and that just never works. And so a lot of this time we're like, okay, well, we're not making demos. This is the record. This first initial feeling is what's going to be contained here. That was a great formula. I think for the next record I would love to continue this same path because it just seems really fruitful and open. That whole process just continued to play out every time we got together, and then present a bunch of homework too. Sometimes we'd leave the studio after the week and we'd have two or three songs, or four songs, whatever the case may be, but no lyrics. And so for some of these songs on this record, I was like, oh, I really love this. I love this instrumental. So I just like listen to the instrumental of it and go on walks. And there's a park near our house that's like one of the like only old growth forests remaining in West Seattle. And I'd walk through this. It's got trails carved through it, but there's just these massive, amazing trees and just moss everywhere. It's extreme Pacific Northwest environs for those who are familiar. Anyway, so and we are lucky that we have this nearby, and it's just become this like it's my happy place. I was in there one day and encountered a woman who was in there, and she was calling it a forest bath, and totally it's totally what it is. And so I would go through there and with these melodies in my head, and just lines would start appearing, and I'd jot it down on my phone. And by the end of the walk, I'd have like the lyrics to the song pretty much almost all there. And I would go then on my home recording situation, I would track those ideas and refine them when it were as needed, and then bring that back to the band. And so there was a bunch of that kind of like spontaneity too, with regard to how the lyrical content was coming as well. I think, and I'll give credit to the Rick Rubin book was very well timed. The creative act, because a lot of the concepts about allowing the creative act to happen rather than again strangling it into existence, as I mentioned, there was a lot of that, at least on my mind as I was going through it, and not forcing things. There was a sort of sense of when you no longer feel like you're the one who's writing the thing, that's when the purest and most honest writing happens. So maybe it's channeling through my pen or my mind, but I don't necessarily have I don't have ownership of it in the way that I would if I was like writing my 5 paragraph essay, in school, or I had to labor over this thing. There's an ease to it, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say.
Is there a feeling that you associate with that, or especially now this version of it that you're describing? So you're walking in the forest, moss, peat, all of the things are around, and you're listening to a song. I mean, and you've connected with this truth that the song the stuff that you want is the stuff that's going to kind of come naturally, that you're not going to feel like you're forcing it. But when that's successfully happening, like, is there any kind of a tangible recognizable feeling that you can now associate with that, where it's like, this is the good stuff?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's ironic because it's like, okay, well, you still get to like quote unquote take credit for it after the fact, but like when you don't think that you're the one doing it in the process, there's just a freedom of like, is this line cheesy? Like, I don't care. This is the line that's happening right now. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, it's just it's a relaxed feeling. It's not butting up against anything. It's very open, and it's kind of counter to how I had experienced things for a long time because of just this maybe societal urge to be productive and this and that and like show up with something, work, always be writing, blah blah blah, show up and do the thing. And this is the opposite of that because it's removing that fabricated sense of urgency, and realizing like, oh, the greatest song can be written in 10 minutes, but it wasn't going to write itself if you were in the room, like staring at your computer, ripping your hair out trying to write it. It actually wrote itself when you like took your shoes off and kicked around in the stream in the forest. You know what I mean? And you weren't trying. All of a sudden, it just showed up, and that to me is so freeing and so exciting because it makes the task of being an artist and being a writer like so much more enjoyable and so much more sustainable. And like you get to be like, oh wow, okay, so that's what it is.
Let's talk a little bit specifically about After the Setting Sun, which, when folks are hearing this, is the song that will have just been shared along with the album announcement, and such a beautiful tune, and the opening track on the album. Tell me a bit about kind of the developed genesis and development of that song.
Yeah, this is actually one of the few that did have a demo, although it was created in the same fashion as I described earlier, where before there was the demo, we were on one of our recording sessions in Seattle at Studio Litho, and John had tuned one of the guitars to this open tuning. And I never play open tuning. I always play standard tuning. And it was like, okay, you have to play it proper. You have to do this and that. Again, it's that kind of fabricated sense of formality or whatever. I don't know, that I felt like I had to live by for a long time. But anyway, so he's got this guitar tuned in a strange way. And I was like, rather than tuning it back to normal, which is maybe would have been one of my older impulses, I just like, okay, let's play with this. And so I started messing around with that tuning. And so the beginning inklings of the melody for After the Setting Sun came. And I just voice memoed that. And I didn't think too much about it at the time because I was trying to just let stuff happen, not overthink it. And so then Kenny came into town on New Year's Day, or no, the day after New Year's Day. He came over, and we were like, okay, let's write some tunes together because we had done that on the last record and had some decent success writing tunes that way. I remembered, oh, I have this voice memo from this weird tuning, and so I showed him the first little verse of it, and then the two of us just like the song just clicked into place. All these different parts came together, and it was Kenny and myself and Charity in the studio doing that. A little bit of lyrical stuff started to bubble up at that point. The setting, here comes the setting sun, or after the setting sun, those lines were coming in, and I was realizing what the song was going to be about because we had been going through the loss of some family members, and certain people in the band lost some people that were really important to them, and there was, it was one of those moments where mortality and the loss of pillars in your life happen, and so all of these feelings of experiences that I had gone through and what that grief looks like and how that manifests and the questions that show up in your mind when you're processing that kind of profound sense of loss and grief, and also kind of imagining it from the perspective of the person who's passed away, and like these people wouldn't want you to suffer, in their absence. They would want you to feel the joy and the comfort that they would be able to provide for you if they were still there. And so there's sort of like simultaneous, holding of deep sorrow and pain, but also an attempt at finding solace and comfort through the acknowledgement and reverence for the relationship that doesn't just go away when the person goes away, and so there's a little bit of that in this song, that bittersweet joy in the moment, knowing it's not going to last, but there's still joy, and that joy doesn't just disappear. So the song is doing its best to come to terms with that.
It's a gorgeous tune.
Oh, thank you.
Well, I think that's all I've got for you, Matty.
Oh, thank you.
No worries. Thank you so much for getting together with me.
Thank you. Yeah, that was really nice.
Well, that about does it for this episode. I'm grateful to Matty for that conversation. Aperture, the upcoming album by The Head and the Heart, is available now for pre-order and pre-save at theheadandtheheart.com, where you can also get tickets for their upcoming shows. And if you want to find other episodes of the podcast, those are at jennylsq.com and on podcast platforms. Reach me with feedback or questions at lsqpod@gmail.com. or on either Instagram or Blue Sky @JennyLSQ. Thanks again for listening. I'll talk to you next time.